Hello, I am very thankful you're here. This is Jennifer McGuire. Today I am sharing with you some tips and techniques for making the most of your ink when you are stenciling. Now, stencils are really popular right now. I really like them because they can be used in so many ways. The price point is good, and layering stencils make me very happy. So I thought it would be fun to kind of focus on how to step things up and also make sure you're not wasting your ink. I will be creating several examples in hopes that you can learn from this and create these types of cards using some stencils that you likely already have on hand. Now for my first few cards, I'll be using a new kit that I can safely say is my favorite kit of all time. I love this kit, and you'll see I use it in many ways today. This is the Zero Waste Flowery Pattern Kit. It's the Craft Your Life kit from Altenew. It includes this large 6x8 stamp set with that beautiful outline floral image that you could definitely just stamp and color however you want. There are coordinating dies to cut out those 3 large sentiments, and I really like the style of those sentiments. I also like that there's a few other style sentiments that are smaller, so you can team them together nicely. Now that big background stamp you could use as a background, or if you want to, this large die is included that allows you to cut out all of those flowers at once. So you can easily and very quickly make a bunch of flower die cuts to create a wreath on your card, create a border, whatever you would like. There is also a coordinating embossing folder included. Now what you can do is cut out some of those flowers and add it on top of the embossing folder, or you can use the embossing folder to add dimension to your flower die cuts, which is really cool, and I'll show you that later. The kit also includes layering stencils that line up really easy. You can see that the images are engraved on the stencil, so you can easily line up with the stenciling you've already done. So the stencils can be used with or without the stamp set. I will be showing both so you can see the different looks you can get. Now there is this guide that comes with it with some card ideas, color suggestions, and tips for layering up the stencils, but they really are easy to line up. So I'm really crazy about this kit. I just think it can be used in so many different ways. This is the Craft Your Life kit, which you need a subscription to get. If you want to subscribe to be able to get this particular kit, you have to do so by July 2nd of 2023. Right now it's only available through subscription. I will link below to subscription details. You can cancel at any time. It's really a great kit each month, different style, and I always like it. Now, if you aren't into kits, there is this Zero Waste 3D floral cover die available. So it's just a die, and it cuts that background and all those flowers. And those flowers have little impressions in them. So you can take all of those flowers and create a background, as you see, or a cluster of flowers, however you want. I really like this die. I think I've shown this in videos before. I've done a ton of die cutting with it in different colors, and I'm in the process of making a bunch of cards with those backgrounds, the negative spaces, and all the colorful die cuts. So I just am a big fan of these dies that have a lot to offer, that create a lot of pieces to work with, and this kit that I'm using today is a good example of that. And again, I'm not using this particular die. Instead, I'm focusing on the kit. I just wanted to show this to you. Okay, let's get started on today's cards. Now, for the first couple, I'm creating 2 backgrounds at once, and I'm starting with the stencils on both of them. I am using Altenew satin masking tape to hold my stencil in place onto white cardstock. You can use whatever tape you want. I really like this tape because it's great to hold stencils in place, and you can reuse the pieces multiple times. Now, when I'm creating, I oftentimes stick a bunch of pieces on my arm so I can quickly grab them and add them to my project. You can also stick it on your desk, but my desk usually gets covered with a bunch of stuff, so it's handy to have it on my arm. I'm using Altenew Fresh Dye ink. This is the Lettuce Celebrate, which is a beautiful, perfect green. I love this color. And I'm also using a small ink blending tool from Altenew. I'm doing selective inking here, so I'm only inking up some of the leaves with this green color. So I have this piece of release paper. It's trash from when I did use some double-sided adhesive sheets in a different project. I like to keep release paper because it's great to hold down over a stencil when you're inking to mask off certain areas. The back side of this release paper is very slick, so the ink will wipe right off, and you can use this scrap over and over again. It's very handy and a great way to use your scraps or your trash in a creative way. So I am just inking some of the leaves with this color. I'm putting the ink heavier towards the base of the leaves and lighter towards the tip of the leaves. This is very easy to do. Just go heavy from one direction and lighter towards the opposite. So I did all of those leaves with that green. Now I'm switching to another color. This is Parrot. This happens to be the crisp dye ink, which is the older Altenew dye ink. You could use any inks you want here. I just chose the colors I wanted. This is more of a lime green, and I'm applying this on a few of the other leaves on the stencil. I'm not caring too much if I'm picking up some of that other green color while I'm doing this blending. They're all different shades of green, so it's okay. Now I'm on to Eucalyptus from the fresh dye ink. This is more of a blue-green, and I'm finishing off the remaining leaf openings on the stencil. Yes, it takes more time to do selective inking like this, but it's definitely worth it because it really steps up your stenciling. Now you'll notice here that you've got beautiful results, but I also have a lot of ink left over on my stencil. Lots of ink. So I'm going to take that stencil with all the ink still on it and place it onto another piece of cardstock to create another background. And this time I'm taking a large blending brush and I'm just rubbing all of those different greens into the openings of the stencil. So I'm mixing all of those together. I'll come up with a new shade of green ink, right? And it will just be an even application over everything. So I didn't let that ink go to waste. I made sure that I used all of the extra on that last one. I didn't add any ink for that second one. All right, now back to the first panel, and I'm taping down the next stencil. It's very easy to line up because the stencils have little engraved marks that show you where to line up with the inking you've already done. Very easy to use. Now I've got this pink color here and it is vibrant. It's very, very vibrant. You can see I am taking ink off of the ink pad and then dabbing the excess ink off into the lid so that I'm using less of that ink when I ink up my brush. That way I don't end up super dark on my cardstock. I want it to be these flowers to be dark towards the center, but lighter towards the tips. So by knocking off some of that extra ink into the lid, I can do that. I can control how much ink I'm putting down. And all that excess ink is staying in the lid, so I can keep picking it up and it's not going to waste. If I were to dab off the extra ink onto my desk or onto scrap cardstock, it goes to waste. This way, that ink is in the lid and I can grab it whenever I want. This is a great way to get a lighter result from a darker color. Next up, we have Lemonade Stand, which is a great yellow. Now I'm putting this over some of the floral openings, making sure I put a heavier amount towards the base of this flower and less towards the tips. That just gives the look of dimension. It's a great way to get faux dimension. Again, I have that release paper scrap in my hand, so I can mask off any flowers as I go. Now you'll notice as I'm doing these flowers, I'm using a smaller ink blending brush from Altenew. This is probably the blending brush size I use the most because I can do selective coloring. Probably the blending brush size I use the second most would be that really big one that you saw me use earlier. That one's great for creating backgrounds quickly. But I think it's good to have a few different sizes so you can get into smaller or larger areas easily. Once I've done all of that stencil, I'll take that off of our first background and go to that second extra background. Remember where I used all that extra green ink? I'll line this stencil up, and this time I'm going to take some of that pink ink from the lid of my ink pad. I'll use a big blending brush, pick up some of that pink ink, and just spread all of that excess ink around over this stencil. Now there will still be some ink on the stencil, but I'm really making better use of my ink and not letting as much go to waste. By the way, I have another idea for using this extra ink, which I'll show you in a moment. All right, so now let's go back to our first background, do some more selective inking. I'm lining up that next stencil. Remember, it's super easy to do because of those engraved lines. That is so helpful. Here I'm going in with some orange, and I'm placing this ink over the little dots that are in the background. You could use a fun, like maybe gold pigment ink here if you wanted to, but I thought the orange would be a nice touch. Then I'm coming in with yellow and putting that over some of the other openings. So some of the dots will be yellow and some of them will be orange. Then finally, I'm coming in with a really fine brush and I'm applying a darker brown towards the center of the flowers. So some of these openings are for the flower centers, and that's where I'm applying the brown. And I love that background already. So now I can go to the second background where we're using our extra ink, line up that stencil. It has lots of yellow, orange, and brown on it. I'll take a large blending brush, and I'm not adding any ink to it. It might have some residual ink on the brush from older projects, but really the ink I'm applying is that ink that's already on the stencil. So not adding anything new. And there we have this background building up, just using that extra ink. Now it's time for the final layering stencil for this first one. And I'm using Just Green, which is a nice dark Kelly green. And I'm applying that over most of the openings here. Now I am doing a very heavy amount because these are the lines on the leaves. Now notice that some of the openings on the stencil are for the centers of the flowers, and I don't want those to be green. I actually did one green, but I decided to be careful from then on, stop and clean my stencil, which I do with using just a couple quick sprays of rubbing alcohol in a dry cloth. Then I'll line that stencil back up, and I'll do a vibrant pink on top of those other floral openings. I didn't want the green to mix with the pink. That's why I cleaned my stencil there in the middle. If it's the same color family, I don't mind if they get mixed a little bit, but I didn't want the green and pink to mix. And look at that fun result. I'm crazy about it. Now this one, I'm not going to do that last stencil. That last stencil adds the leaf and flower details. Instead, on this one, I'll use that stamp that comes with the kit. So I have my Altenew stamp wheel here. I've placed my background into the stamp wheel on the sticky mat. I have lined up the stamp with it. I'm inking up the stamp with Altenew Obsidian black pigment ink. And then I'll place this on top of the stamp wheel and press down. And this will give me an outline look to the inking that we've already done. So this one, I used the stamp. The last background, I didn't. And I'll have two different looks. I think I prefer the background where there is no outline, but it's nice that I can get two different looks from this kit. This is something I really encourage you to do, is before you invest in a product, think about the many ways you can use it. You'll more likely use it more and get more value out of it if you can come up with different looks from that product. This is a definite good example of that. All right, now on this one where we didn't do the stamping, I'm lining up that die. It's really easy to line up. And I'll run that through my die cut machine. And that will cut all of these individual flowers and even the little dots out. So now I have lots of pieces to use on a card or two. And keep in mind you could use that die with colorful cardstock scraps and have solid die cuts instead. That's another way you could use this. But here, let's turn these flowers into a card. I have a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch top folding white note card, and I'm putting 2 pieces of tape along it. That will just be a guide. I'm going to stamp that Beyond Grateful in that area when I remove the tape. So it's just a guide for me so I can glue die cuts above and below this area. I used 2 pieces of tape to do that because one piece of tape wasn't wide enough. So by offsetting the second one, it's wide enough to mask off an area for my sentiment. All right, so now I am adding these die cuts just around that purple tape. I'm trying to go up as close to that purple tape edge as possible so that I have a definite line there. And I'm filling these in, gluing them each pretty close together. You could glue additional die cuts to the back of these to give them dimension, but I thought that would take a lot of time, so I'm just gluing these directly onto the card. I find it fun to arrange these little die cuts. It's kind of like putting a puzzle together. And look how many die cuts I have. It's pretty easy to find whatever size I need to fill in different places. Okay, once I have all of those done and glued in place, I will add little dots in between. Remember that stenciling and the die created all those little colorful dots? I'll place those into any gaps. You could use gemstones here if you prefer. Now I will carefully remove that tape, and I can save it because I can reuse that several times. And that leaves me with a gap to stamp our sentiment. Once all those die cuts are dry, I will trim off the excess from the side, giving me a nice clean look. At this point, I decided to do a little bit of layering. So at the center of all of the flowers, I'm adding one of the little stamped and die cut dots just to give a little layering, but you could totally skip that if you want to. I love how it looks like I took a lot of time to ink up all of those individual die cuts, but I was able to do so very quickly using this really creative product kit. And I'm using some of the extra leftover flowers and leaves on the inside of the card. So here's a closer look at the completed card. I love these inked flowers and leaves so much. And notice how I was able to give the look of depth by doing darker inking towards the base of the leaves and the center of the flowers and lighter inking towards the tip. Doesn't take much effort, and it gives great results in the end. And by the way, that sentiment that I really like is also included in that kit. All right, now let's create a quick card using the other background. This is the one where I used the extra ink and I did the stamping on top. This time I decided not to use the coordinating die to cut them out. I could if I wanted to, but instead I chose to leave it as a complete background. I have a pink top folding note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, and I thought I would glue this background kind of an angle in the corner. This is my kind of go-to design when I'm not really sure what to do with the background and I want it to be the focal point. Now underneath it, I stamped a sentiment. This is also in the kit stamp set. I'm stamping that with VersaMark ink and adding white embossing powder, and I'll heat set it. I thought that bright white sentiment was nice on that bright pink cardstock. Now I did want to add a place in the inside to write a personal message. Whenever I use a color note card, I like to add a white insert on the inside. You don't have to do that, but I think it does give a nice finished look, and then you can use whatever color pen you want to write your message. Now on here, you could leave it as is. Remember, we did really fast inking to create this background. I didn't do selective inking. I didn't use multiple colors. Instead, I just used excess ink that was left over on my stencils. So I thought I would step it up a little bit by using markers. I'm using Copic markers, but you could use any markers, any colored pencils you may have, just to add a little bit of darker color at the base of the leaves and at the center of the flowers. Doesn't take long, it doesn't have to be perfect by any means, and it does add a lot to that background. I'm finishing it off by doing dots of glossy accents at the center of the flowers and on the little dots in the background. After giving the glossy accents some time to dry, here is a look at our completed card. If you wanted to step this up a bit, you could add some gemstones or pearls, or you could use maybe a glitter pen on some of the flowers for a bit of sparkle. But I decided to keep it simple. I really like the bold color and that bright white sentiment. This has a different look than the other card, and it uses that leftover ink that we had on the stencils. Very easy to do. All right, I have another idea for you on using up that extra ink that's left over on a stencil. This one is really fun and gives a watercolor background look. Okay, so I have off screen inked up the leaves like I did on the last example. Now it's time to do the flowers. Instead of doing each of the flowers a different color, I'm just using 2 colors and just doing them in different areas. So I'm putting some dark blue kind of in 3 different spots and then some turquoise in the remaining spots. You'll see that some of the colors blend together. I think that's perfectly fine. This is just a faster way to do multiple colors over one stencil. Again, I'm using the bigger brush here to cover the bigger area. Love the look of that. I really like that blue color. Next, I've got the next stencil. This does the dots and the flower centers. And I'm using the same two colors, but this time I'm putting a heavier amount of ink down so that it'll appear darker. So I put down some of the turquoise. On top of that, I'm putting some of the darker blue in some of the areas. Now I will remove the stencil and set that background aside. We'll come back to it. But next, I'm going to use all that leftover ink on my stencil for a fun ink transfer technique. I need to set up my die cut machine as if I were doing an impression with a die. That involves a flexible mat. Mine is that gray mat there. Most die cut machines can do this. You just need to read the instructions on how to make an impression with the die. So I have my machine set up for that with a piece of white cardstock there. I will now mist the inked side of my stencil about 6 times with water, and then I'll flip it over and lay it down onto that white cardstock. Once I have it laid down, I'll put the top plate on top and run it through. This will press that stencil into the cardstock and transfer a lot of that ink onto our cardstock, giving a really cool look. You'll have some impression, so there'll be some raised areas, but look at anywhere that was open on the stencil, those dots are now white, and you have a fun background that you can use on a card. And because I used the leftover ink from our floral background, it's a perfect match. All right, now let's go back to our floral background. I did that final stencil that adds the details to the leaves and the flowers. So I did that in blues and greens. I then used that same large die to cut these flowers out as I did before. So now I have a bunch of green leaves and blue flowers. This time I wanted some dimension behind them, so I used the coordinating die and cut from just some scrap white cardstock so I could glue a solid white die cut behind our blue inked die cuts. Just to give some dimension, you could skip that or use foam tape if you prefer. I'm gluing them onto that inked background. That's the background we did by transferring the extra ink with water onto our cardstock. I just trimmed it down. And when I glue these on, it's easy because I'm just following the outlines that the stencil impressed into that background. So I'm gluing all of those leaves and flowers in place, and also I'm adding a few of the layering dots. Any of the white dots that you see on the background were left uninked because of that stencil technique that we did. After all of my glue dried from adding those die cuts to the background, I can trim everything off the edge. Whenever I have die cuts cut off the edge like this, I do like to take a paper sander and just smooth those edges. It's really easy to do, and it just gives a nice clean edge to the entire card front. Now this panel was cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches, and I glued it onto a note card that's white. It's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I stamped "I'm here for you" with black ink. That sentiment is from the same kit, and I used the coordinating die to cut it out. I added some dimension behind that sentiment, and I'll glue it right on the top center of the card. I didn't want to do much else to this card. I felt like it had so much interest already, so I left it with just a few little clear gemstones scattered in the background, and that's it. I did decide I wanted some of my flower centers to be a little bit darker, just for some pops of darker color. So I came in with a dark blue marker, any marker or pencil would work here, and just added it on top of some of our inked flowers. So here's a look at the completed card. You have bold inked flower and leaf die cuts. Then you have that kind of watercolory background that we created with that leftover ink on the stencil. Now this kind of ink transfer or faux monoprint technique is one I've done in videos in the past. If you want to see more that you can do with that technique, I will link to a video up here on the top right and at the end of this video, and you can check it out for more ideas. I really feel like this is a great way to make the most of your ink, and you can do that technique with any stencil, even a single stencil. Okay, I have one more using this card kit. This is a pretty simple one, but I'll show you how to add texture and detail to these inked and die cut flowers. I also have a little trick to save your ink once again. Now I have this stencil here where I did a lot of pink ink. I wiped most of it off, but there's still some on there. And I didn't realize I didn't wipe it all off. So I came in with this teal color and realized it was picking up some of that pink ink on the stencil. But that's okay. Look at that. I'm creating a new color. The pink ink that was left over on the stencil, which wasn't much, and this pool color ink that I'm adding on top made this beautiful lilac color. Absolutely gorgeous. Then I came in with an Aqualicious color, and I'm adding that just at the base of the flowers or the center of the flowers. So we'll have these two-tone flowers that look kind of lilac and turquoise. And I did that just by kind of mixing some inks together using some leftover ink that had settled on that stencil. Now, if you want to really clean your stencil, you can use rubbing alcohol, just spray it on there, wipe it away with a dry cloth. If you have some stubborn ink that you want to remove from a stencil, I recommend using a stamp cleaner for that. All right, so now over this stencil, I'm just using the blue alone. And look at that fun color that we got by simply using some of our leftover ink and mixing it with another color. All right, now I thought I'd add some dimension to these flowers, some details. And I'm doing that with the embossing folder. This embossing folder is included in the kit. You could definitely do a background with it, but I instead am taking the little inked floral and leaf die cuts that we created, and I'm placing them inside of the embossing folder to add some texture. So this embossing folder has flowers and leaves that are the same size as the die cuts we've created. So I just line it up with the flower in the embossing folder and close it, run it through, and look at that dimension. It is so cool in real life. I wish you could see it, but it really makes a big difference. Now, I'm going to do this a few more times, and you can do multiple die cuts at once. One way you can do so is to just lay the die cuts into the folder, lining them up with the same shaped flower or leaf, then close it and run it through your die cut machine. Now, this is a 3D embossing folder, so I'm following the instructions that my Spellbinders Platinum die cut machine has for using a 3D embossing folder. You'll just want to follow whatever instructions your particular die cut machine says for these types of folders. Now, another way you can do this is put a little piece of tape to tape that die cut in place. That way you can look through the embossing folder to line up the shape very easily. And look at how it adds so much to these little flowers. So the top one is without the embossing folder and the bottom one is with it. It took me about 5 minutes to do all of these, but I definitely think it was worth it. Now off screen, I assembled this into a simple card. I used a piece of masking tape to create that angle, and I glued all of those die cuts below that tape. I then removed the tape and added a stamp sentiment, again from the kit stamp set. And for a little bit of sparkle, I used a glitter pen at the center of some of the flowers. So here's a closer look at that completed card. You can see the sparkle at the center of the flowers, and you can see the dimension that all of these flowers and leaves have thanks to that embossing folder. That's one of the advantages of kits like this or product bundles, because you can use them together to create different looks. And here, that embossing folder added so much to these die cuts. Okay, I have one more card for you. This one does not use that kit. Instead, it uses some other products. But I have a stenciling tip for you that might scare you, but I promise you it can be really helpful. This time I'm using the Altenew Dynamic Duo Hanging Houseplants. Now, Dynamic Duos are a set of stencils and a stamp set that come together as a bundle, and they work together really well. This is available in a subscription like the other kit was, or you can buy it separately. I will be following the design of the card in the guide. Now, this is where I think some of you might panic, but I promise you it's worth it. Now, this stencil has different areas on it, and they're separated by etched lines. You can leave the stencil as is, but what I'm going to do is cut along those etched lines, and this creates many stencils. I find it easier to figure out how to line these up and work with them if I have them cut apart. After all, when there's a line like that on your stencil, that etched line, that means it's for a different area. So it's really a bunch of stencils all put together on one big stencil. So cutting it up just makes more sense to me. It may not make much sense to you, but I wanted you to see it because if it is helpful to you, I think it's worth trying. So this is how I will use this. It does have on the stencil little engraved marks that show you what order to go in so you can follow the guide. And also there are the etched lines on the stencil so you can easily see where it lines up with what you've already done. I promise it's not hard to do even after you've cut it up. Now, you do need some masking tape when you cut your stencil down, right? Because you have a smaller stencil and you don't want to ink off the edges. But you would have had to use masking tape anyways to mask off the other parts of the stencil if you kept it big. So it really doesn't matter. You're still going to have to do a little bit of masking. But this way, you're just working with one mini stencil at a time. So I'm using that beautiful blue color. I'm crazy about that Ride the Wave color. And I thought I would use some of that Alpine color on the bottom. I decided not to. I just did heavier with that blue at the top of the pot and lighter towards the bottom. All right, now I'm moving on to the next pot, which I'll put on the left-hand side. By the way, I'm doing all of this on a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch top folding white note card. So this will be a 1-layer card. All right, now we're doing the final pot. Move that little mini stencil over there, and I'm masking over it. And all three are the same color. You could do them different colors if you prefer. Now I'm doing the first leaves for one of the plants. Again, I'm just following the guide and the little numbers engraved on the stencils. It's easy to figure out. Hard to see in the video, and I apologize for that. But do know that companies are doing a lot of things to make it easier to figure out how to layer stencils. The etched lines that line up with the inking you've already done is a big time saver, and this stencil set has it, just like the last one I used. So each time I line up a layer of these plants, I'm using a different shade of green. You could get more creative with it if you want to. You could do darker in some areas, lighter in other areas. I'm just putting that color down pretty quickly. I honestly was running out of time in my day. Lila was going to be coming back from a play date, so I wanted to get this card done in time. This is going to one of my friends. I think he'll really like it. These are his colors and his style. So I had somebody in mind. I really wanted to complete it. By the way, I'm going to hold up one of my little mini stencils so you can see. See, it says C4 there, and it also has engraved lines for the other leaves. That C4 refers to which you use together and in which order, and it goes along with the guide that I showed you earlier. So it really isn't hard to figure out. So I will continue to do this for the other flower pots. There are 3 different plants included in these stencils in 3 different pots, so you can easily put a trio on a card. And all of these stencils fit together nicely. They're actually not a layering set in that your inking doesn't go on top of the inking you've already done. Instead, this is a building stencil set where the images kind of build next to each other to form those beautiful leaf images. Now I'm going to skip through some of this because it's just following those stencils, but the idea here is to make the most of your inks by cutting your stencils down so you have smaller mini stencils to work with. Sometimes it's helpful in figuring out how they all go together. Once I've done all the inking on the stencils, I'll use the stamp set that comes with it and line up these little holders, hanging holders for it. I forget what they're called, but I'm just stamping those with black ink. If you wanted to, you could do maybe a gold or silver embossing powder. There's also a line image, so you can connect each of those to the top of the card. Now you could leave this as is, but another way to make the most of your stencils is to add a little bit of marker or colored pencil, which I showed you before. In this case, I'm just drawing little lines in the leaves. I am not an artist. I am just winging it here. And you can see I'm not taking much effort or time to do so. And in the end, it kind of blends in and it'll look really nice. So don't be afraid to add those little details with the marker. It can really step up your stenciled results. Finally, I used a white gel pen to add little dots to each of the pots. I just felt like it made it pop a bit more. White gel pen against bold color like that blue really looks nice. Now for a sentiment on this one, I used another kit or product bundle from Altenew. This is the Build a Garden. Now this one is available in subscription, or you can just buy the bundle alone. It comes with the stamp set that you see there, layering stencils, and a coordinating die. And I think there is a mini blending brush that comes with this also. Now I'm just showing you this here. I love the stenciled results of this. Look at that flower card over on the left. I think that's really beautiful and unique looking. However, today I didn't have time to use this set. Instead, I'm just using one of the sentiments from the stamp set. I thought this sentiment was very beautiful and perfect for this card. The sentiment simply says, "You are loved and appreciated." And I don't know if there's a better message to give to someone. Hearing someone say that to you really can make a big difference in your day. So I really like that I can give that message to someone else. I did add some gold sequins onto the hanging pots. I just thought a little bit of bling would be fun. And there is our completed card. It is a one-layer card. We did add a little bit of dimension with those sequins, but otherwise it's a really easy one to mail. And I made the most of my ink by cutting my stencils up smaller, so I had a smaller area to work with, and by adding some little details with a marker. All right, there you have just some fun, easy ideas for really making the most of your inks, especially when doing stenciling. I will link to all the products that I used in my description below. And at the end here, I will link to a couple other related videos that really will help you get more from your ink. I thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you soon.